My son-in-law thought he could barge into my home with his friends, but he left alone. The quiet of my Upper East Side penthouse is a luxury, something money can buy but can easily destroy. Tonight, it was destroyed by a phone call. Dad, my daughter, Chloe, said anxiously, Mark and some important business partners are coming over. Please, just for tonight, treat him like the successful man he is. I took a sip of Macallan 18, letting the silence linger for a moment. Chloe, honey, I replied, my voice icy. My life's work is to distinguish between assets and liabilities. Your husband, sadly, is the worst investment you've ever made. And I'm not going to pour a single penny of sympathy into a losing venture. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? The quiet was the first thing to go. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence, a settled, weighted calm that George cultivated. Tonight, it had been particularly dense, scented with the leather of his favorite armchair and the crisp, cold air humming just beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. He'd been nursing a Macallan 18, watching the lights of the city blink on like a scattered handful of diamonds, a predictable and soothing performance. Then the phone had buzzed, a waspish, insistent sound against the polished mahogany of the side table. Mark, of course, it was Mark. George, my man. The voice was too loud, a jolt of caffeine George neither wanted nor needed. Big news. Huge. I'm closing a monster deal tonight, and I need to bring some key players by the penthouse. Just for an hour. Show them the victory lap, you know? A crack. That was a word that came to George's mind. A tiny fissure in the forced enthusiasm of Mark's voice. In his old life as a CFO, George had learned to listen for those cracks in the voices of CEOs trying to spin back quarterly earnings. Haste, a glossing over of details, a manufactured boom of confidence. He heard it all now. The penthouse? George said, his own voice carefully neutral. Yeah, the family's little city getaway, Mark said. And there it was again, that casual appropriation. The view alone will seal it. We'll be there in 20. You're a lifesaver, George, seriously. Before George could frame a question, the line went dead. He placed his tumbler down, the clink of glass on wood, the last note of his stolen piece. 20 minutes. Not a request, but a declaration. The landing wasn't so much an arrival as an invasion. The elevator door slid open not to 2 or 3 men, as one might expect for a business meeting, but to a boisterous pack of 6. They spilled into his foyer, a tidal wave of noise, cologne, and the restless energy of young men trying too hard. They were all sharp suits and sharper haircuts, but their laughter was too loud, echoing off the travertine floor and clashing with the quiet dignity of the Calder Mobile turning slowly in the air currents from the open terrace door. Mark was at their center, less a host and more a ringmaster. Gentlemen, Mark boomed, spreading his arms wide as if he were personally responsible for the view of Central Park stretching out behind him. Welcome to the family's little city getaway. He used the word family like a shield, a claim of legitimacy. George, standing by the fireplace, felt a familiar wave of repressed discomfort wash over him. He gave a tight, polite nod as Mark made a series of clumsy, first-name-only introductions. They were all Jakes and Calebs and Todds, their handshakes firm but their eyes darting, cataloging, appraising. They weren't looking at George, they were looking through him, at the real estate, at the art, at the silent testament of wealth he had spent a lifetime carefully, quietly accumulating. The show-off began almost immediately. Mark led them on a tour, his voice a running commentary of possession by association. He bypassed the comfortable, lived-in parts of the penthouse and went straight for the trophies. And this, he said, gesturing with a proprietary sweep of his hand toward the large Helen Frankenthaler that dominated the main wall, a swirling masterpiece of cerulean blue and burnt sienna. George picked this one up years ago. A steal, really. He has a good eye, but I'm the one who told him it would triple in value. It was such a breathtakingly blatant lie that George almost laughed. He had bought that painting the year his daughter, Chloe, was born. Mark had still been in elementary school, probably trading baseball cards. blissfully unaware of abstract expressionism. George had bought it because the colors reminded him of a sunset over the ocean, a memory of a trip with his late wife. It had never been about the value, it had been about the feeling. Mark was attempting to steal not just the credit for the acquisition, but the very memory itself. One of the young men, a slick-haired kid with a jawline that seemed too perfect to be real, let out a low whistle. "Mark, man, you married up!" The group chuckled, and Mark's laughter rose above theirs, loud and full of a desperate, brittle smugness. "I like to think Chloe married up," he retorted, clapping the kid on the shoulder. "It's all about synergy, my friend. Synergy." George didn't follow them. He stayed by the window, an anchor of stillness in the swirling eddy of Mark's performance. From here, he had a perfect vantage point. He activated what he used to call his social eye, a skill honed in countless boardrooms. He watched Mark's friends. They were laughing, yes, but their eyes were busy. They exchanged fleeting glances when Mark's back was turned, a flicker of a shared joke, a subtle raising of an eyebrow. They weren't entirely convinced. George saw it clearly. They were here for the show, but they were also the critics. They were evaluating Mark. And George realized with a cold certainty that his son-in-law was sweating under their gaze, desperate for their approval. This was when the former CFO took over. George's mind, trained to dissect balance sheets and find the hidden rod, began to analyze Mark. He didn't listen to the words anymore. The buzzwords like exponential growth and disrupting the market were just noise. He looked at the data. He noticed Mark's shoes, expensive Italian loafers, but the leather was scuffed and the heels were worn down on one side. A man closing a monster deal would have bought new shoes. He saw the watch on Mark's wrist. It was a passable imitation of a Patek Philippe, but the light caught the face just wrong. It was a fake. A good one, but a fake nonetheless. Most telling, however, was the look in Mark's eyes. Every time one of his friends asked a specific question about the supposed deal, something beyond the vague platitudes, a flicker of panic, as quick and telling as a stock market ticker flashing red, would cross his face before being buried under a fresh wave of bravado. He talked about assets and projections, but his balance sheet, the one George could see in his desperate eyes, was deep in the red. A sudden, sharp memory pierced through George's analytical calm. Chloe, 2 years ago, her face earnest and glowing with love, defending Mark against his unspoken reservations. "You just don't understand him, Dad. He's a visionary. You're just too old school to see it." He hadn't argued. He had loved his daughter too much to shatter her illusions. So he had stepped back, hoping against his own better judgment that he was wrong, that her love could somehow magically transform this posturing boy into a man of substance. The memory was a fresh pang of regret, a tragedy of his own making. The group eventually settled on his white leather sofas, Mark pouring George's best single malt with a far too liberal hand. George watched the amber liquid slosh into the crystal glasses, another piece of his life being used as a prop. The laughter quieted into a low hum of conversation, but the tension remained, a tight wire strung across the room. George realized this wasn't a business meeting, but a performance. Mark wasn't closing a deal. He was auditioning. And it seemed, was the unwitting stagehand. The performance, it turned out, was a multi-act play. Having exhausted the main floor, Mark, his face flushed with George's Macallan and his own bravado, clapped his hands together. "Right, gentlemen, enough of the living quarters. Who wants to see the real vault?" A chorus of whoops and hollers. George felt a new kind of annoyance, sharper and colder than the last. He knew where this was going. His wine cellar was not a vault. It was a library, a sanctuary. Each bottle was a book with a story, a marker of a specific time and place in his life. It was a space he rarely shared, a place of quiet contemplation. He followed the noisy procession down the spiral staircase, his hand trailing on the cool iron railing. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and cork. The group pushed into the small, perfectly calibrated room, their loud voices and restless energy a desecration of the hallowed quiet. They gawked at the neatly racked bottles, their eyes scanning for impressive-looking labels like tourists in a museum they didn't understand. Mark, of course, played the expert curator. He strode to the back wall, to the section George reserved for his most treasured Bordeaux. Without a moment's hesitation, his hand closed around the neck of a bottle. Chateau Margaux, 1982. George's breath caught in his throat. Of all the bottles, he had purchased a case of it the week Chloe was born. He'd opened one on her 21st birthday, another on her wedding day to this boy. The remaining bottles were supposed to be for future milestones. The birth of his first grandchild, her 40th birthday. They were liquid memories, patient and waiting. This old stuff, Mark said, holding the bottle aloft for his acolytes to admire. He didn't know what it was, not really. He just knew it looked old and important. George has crates of it. He won't even notice it's gone. He turned, grabbing a corkscrew from the small tasting table. To success, gentlemen! The shock was a physical blow, leaving George momentarily winded. He watched, frozen, as Mark butchered the process. The foil was torn away raggedly. The corkscrew went in at an angle. With a final, brutish tug, the cork came out with a wet, sucking sound that seemed obscene in the stillness. As he poured a generous splash into his glass, his hand jerked, and a stream of deep, ruby red wine splashed onto the pristine white marble floor. A dark, ugly stain, like a wound. George stared at the spreading blotch of red. It was a powerful image of destruction and disrespect. The waste, the carelessness, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. The anger, when it came, was not hot and explosive, but a cold, heavy weight settling in his chest. The young man murmured their appreciation, gulping down the complex, delicate wine as if it were cheap table red. They didn't taste the notes of blackcurrant and cedar. They tasted the idea of money. George's social eyes swept across their faces. A couple of them, the ones in the back, looked uncomfortable. They glanced at the stain on the floor, then at George's granite face. They knew a line had been crossed. He filed that observation away. This wasn't a monolithic group. They were individuals, and the individuals could be separated from the pack. Mark drained his glass, the wine leaving a purplish stain on his teeth. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and slung an arm around George's shoulders. The gesture was meant to be familiar, comradely. It felt like a yoke. "All right, George. Great pregame," Mark said, his voice thick with the confidence of the truly clueless. "Now for the main event." And he paused for dramatic effect. "I've booked us a table at Per Se, 8 o'clock. Per Se, Thomas Keller's Temple of Gastronomy, a place of hushed reverence and astronomical prices." George looked from the wine stain on the floor to his son-in-law's smug face. "Per Se is quite expensive, Mark." Mark let out a barking laugh. "That's the point. You don't close million-dollar deals over pizza." He squeezed George's shoulder. "I've handled the reservation. I assume you want to put it on your card? The points are much better on the Amex Platinum." There it was. Not a request, but a presumption. A pressure-filled suggestion delivered in front of an audience, designed to make refusal seem petty and miserly. And then, the final, manipulative twist of the knife. "Come on, George, loosen the purse strings," Mark said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's for Chloe, remember? A small investment in our future." There's the code. Something inside George shifted. The observer retreated and the strategist took the field. He was no longer analyzing Mark. He was formulating a response. Mark, encouraged by George's silence, saw him as an easy mark, an open wallet. He had no idea he was dealing with a man who had stared down corporate raiders and dismantled fraudulent accounting schemes for a living. George slowly, deliberately, removed Mark's arm from his shoulder. He looked his son-in-law directly in the eye, and for the first time that evening, he smiled. It was a thin, cool smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile that made two of Mark's friends unconsciously take a step back. "Of course, Mark," George said, his voice unnervingly calm. The sudden agreement surprised everyone, most of all Mark, whose own smile faltered for a second. "Anything for my daughter's husband." George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The room went quiet, the low hum of the climate control suddenly audible. "Let me just," George said, his thumb already swiping across the screen, "make a call to confirm the reservation." But as he lifted the phone to his ear, His eyes were still locked on Mark, and everyone in that room knew, with a sudden, prickling certainty, that he wasn't calling the restaurant. The ride to Per Se was a blur of self-congratulatory noise from the back of the Escalade George's car service had sent. George sat in the front, a silent island in a sea of testosterone-fueled chatter, watching the city lights smear across the windows. He'd made his call, not to Chloe, not to his lawyer, but to Paul, the maitre d' at Per Se, a man he'd known for years. "Paul, it's George," he said, his voice low and steady as he stood in the hallway away from the chaos in the cellar. "My son-in-law is bringing a group tonight. He's trying to impress them. He can be rather boisterous." A pause. "Please, indulge him. Whatever he orders, give it to him. Don't worry about any disturbance. I will handle it personally." There had been a moment of hesitation on the other end of the line. Then a quiet. "Of course, George. We will take care of you." The trap was set. Now, all George had to do was let the mouse walk into it. The restaurant was exactly as he remembered. A hushed sanctuary of muted tones, soft lighting, and the clink of fine silver on porcelain. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a quiet, expensive reverence. Mark and his entourage crashed through this serenity like a wrecking ball. Their laughter was a gunshot in the library. Their suits, which had seemed so sharp in the penthouse, now looked like costumes. They were led to the best table, a sweeping banquet with a panoramic view of Columbus Circle. This, George knew, was Paul's doing. Part of the indulgence. Mark slid into the seat as if it were a throne, grabbing the leather-bound menu with a flourish. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He was playing a character who was above such pedestrian concerns as price. "We'll start with a bottle of the Screaming Eagle," he announced to the sommelier, who managed to keep his face a perfect mask of professional neutrality. "And for the food, the chef can prepare a special tasting menu for us. The best of everything." The performance had begun. George watched as the ballet of world-class service began around them, a service they were utterly unworthy of. He felt a pang of second-hand embarrassment, not for himself, but for the staff who had to endure this. He looked around the room, his social eye taking in the landscape of his humiliation. He saw them in the corner, the Abernathys, an elderly couple he and his late wife used to have dinner with once a month. Mrs. Abernathy met his gaze for a fleeting second. Her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and pity before she quickly looked down at her plate. His shame was now public record. The wine arrived. It was decanted with the reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. Mark's friends, to their credit, seemed genuinely intimidated by the bottle, which, as one of them whispered, probably cost more than his car. "Mark, this is insane," the friend said after a hesitant sip. "This bottle costs more than my rent." Mark roared with laughter, the sound causing a ripple of heads to turn across the dining room. He reached over and slapped George on the back, a hard, jarring blow that made George almost choke on the sip of water he'd just taken. "Don't worry about it. Drink up," Mark boomed, his voice echoing in the acoustically perfect room. "The First National Bank of George is open for business, and tonight there's no withdrawal limit. Gare mais, Mike." A few of his friends chuckled nervously, but the insult hung in the air, thick and foul. George felt the blood drain from his face. The cold anger in his chest began to heat, a low, controlled burn. He had endured the invasion of his home, the disrespect of his memories, the theft of his wine, but this reduction of his entire existence to a financial transaction, this public branding was different. This was an act of war. Mark, completely immersed in his illusion of power, was blind to the shift. He mistook George's stunned silence for weakness, for acquiescence. He leaned forward, raising his glass in a mock toast, his voice climbing even louder to encompass the entire, now staring room. "The old man is our personal Adam tonight, boys." The words detonated in the quiet room. Mark's friends burst into a fresh wave of laughter, louder this time, a mixture of shock and drunken sycophancy. The Abernathys were staring openly now, their mouths slightly agape. A woman at a nearby table actually flinched. In that moment, George no longer saw a misguided son-in-law, a flawed husband for his beloved daughter. He saw an enemy who needed to be not just defeated, but dismantled. The laughter died as quickly as it had erupted. An awkward, suffocating silence fell over their table. Even Mark's friends could feel it. The joke had landed wrong. The public humiliation was too raw, too real. They shifted in their seats, avoiding George's gaze, suddenly very interested in the pattern on their bread plates. George didn't say a word. He didn't shout or argue. He did something far more unnerving. He calmly, deliberately, placed his linen napkin on the table beside his untouched plate. He pushed his chair back slowly, the legs making no sound on the plush carpet. He stood up. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, his voice perfectly even, addressed to no one in particular. He then turned and walked. Not hurried, not angry, but with a cold, measured purpose, toward the back of the restaurant, in the direction of the restrooms. Mark thought I was running away to hide my shame. He watched me go with a smug, victorious smirk on his face. The truth was, I was just moving my king into position for checkmate. He didn't go to the restroom. The sign was merely a landmark for the direction he was taking. He bypassed the lacquered door and continued down a short, carpeted hallway to a small, unmarked door he knew led to a service corridor. He slipped through it, the hushed elegance of the dining room replaced by the cool, utilitarian air and the faint, rhythmic hum of a ventilation system. He leaned against the cool plaster wall, the sudden quiet a balm. This wasn't an act of impulse. This was the result of a quiet, agonizing investigation that had been going on for months. His daughter's happiness had been the only thing stopping him. But tonight, that dam had broken. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number from his favorites. It rang twice. "David," he said, his voice low. "It's George." David was a friend from a lifetime ago, now a senior investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal with a bloodhound's nose for financial rot. George had made a quiet, dreadful request a few months back. Keep an eye on Mark's ventures. Keep an ear to the ground. "About Mark," George continued, getting straight to the point. He started up. "Is it as bad as we thought?" There was a pause on the other end, filled with the unspoken weight of bad news. "George?" David's voice was grim. "It's worse. The angel investor he's been touting to second-tier players? He pulled out 6 weeks ago. The company is a ghost. It's running on fumes and fumes alone. He's been shopping around a completely fabricated set of projections." George closed his eyes. It was confirmation of a truth he already felt in his bones. "Got it. Thanks, David." He ended the call, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He stood for a moment longer, taking a single, deep, steadying breath. Then he pushed the door open and walked back into the fray. He returned to a table that had recalibrated in his absence. Mark, believing he had won the skirmish, was gleefully oblivious, holding court and regaling his friends with a story about a fictional yacht trip. The tension had eased, replaced by the warm, fuzzy blanket of expensive wine and false confidence. George slipped back into his seat without a word. The food, an exquisite multi-course tasting menu, began to arrive, but he didn't touch it. He just watched and waited. The moment came, as he knew it would. At the end of the meal, the waiter, with practiced discretion, approached the table. He held a small, tomb-like leather folder. With a slight bow, he placed it on the table with a soft, final thud, right in front of Mark. The folder lay there like a challenge, the final prop in Mark's elaborate play. This was his signal. The curtain was about to rise on George's own performance. George leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. He let the silence stretch for a beat before he spoke, his voice not loud, but clear and sharp enough to cut through the post-dinner haze. "Before we settle this," he began, his eyes moving past Mark to address the young man directly. "I'm just curious, gentlemen. Did Mark tell you he's broke?" A bomb wrapped in silk. It didn't explode immediately. It landed softly, its fuse sizzling. Mark let out a loud, nervous laugh, the sound a little too high-pitched. "What are you talking about, George? Having a little too much wine, are we?" George's gaze didn't waver. He kept his eyes locked on the friends, completely ignoring his son-in-law, a dismissal more profound than any insult. "I'm serious," he said, his voice imbued with the calm authority that demanded to be heard. His tech startup, Innovate Next, it ran out of funding 6 weeks ago. The new round of investment he's been promising you, The one this whole evening is supposed to be about? It doesn't exist. He let that sink in before delivering the killing blow. I know this because the primary investor he's been lying about is an old friend of mine, and I just got off the phone with him. Mark's laughter froze on his face. His friends looked at him, then at George, their easy smiles replaced by a sudden, sharp curiosity. The foundation of their evening was crumbling beneath them. George finally turned his head, his cold, analytical gaze landing on Mark. The dominoes were set. He began to push them. So, Mark, he said, leaning back in his chair, why don't you tell your partners how you plan on paying for this dinner? Or the past 6 months of rent on your Tribeca loft? Or that leased Porsche you have parked downstairs? Each question was a nail hammered into the lid of a coffin. Mark's face, which had been flushed with wine and victory, was now a pale, mottled mask of disbelief and panic. The illusion was not just punctured, it was shredded. He was stripped bare in the bright, unforgiving light of the truth, in front of the very audience he had so desperately tried to calm. The silence that followed George's words was heavier and more profound than the hushed reverence the restaurant usually commanded. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and boisterous energy from the table. For a long, stretched moment, no one moved. The 6 friends were frozen, their faces a gallery of dawning comprehension. They looked from George's calm, implacable expression to Mark's rapidly crumbling facade. They were doing the mental arithmetic, replaying the last few hours, the last few months, and realizing with dawning horror that they hadn't been guests at the celebration. They had been props in a desperate fiction. Mark was the first to break, sputtering like a car running out of gas. He's lying. The deal's it's delayed. You guys know how this works. It's all part of the game. It's off the marks. His voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its earlier booming confidence. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, a friendly face, a believer. He found none. The first crack in his support system came from the slick-haired young man who had earlier complimented him on marrying up. He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that held no humor at all. Broke? He said, shaking his head in disbelief. So that whole story about the funding from Dubai was, what, creative writing? And then, the nature of the laughter at the table changed. It started as a few scattered snickers, but quickly swelled into a wave of open, cutting ridicule. It was the laughter of a pack turning on its weakened leader. They weren't laughing with Mark anymore. They were laughing at him. He's lying, Mark insisted, his voice now cracking with panic. The money's coming, I swear. I disably has... The first friend, the one who'd questioned the cost of the wine, slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He shrugged, a gesture of final, weary resignation. Yeah, I do know how it works, Mark, he said, his voice flat. And I also know a sinking ship when I see one. Sorry, man. I've got an early meeting. He didn't look back as he walked away. The dam had broken. The second friend, a smirk playing on his lips, glanced down at the leather folder containing the bill. Well, he said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, looks like the ATM is out of service. He looked directly at Mark, his eyes glinting with malice. Good luck with that, CEO. He stood, and the remaining 3 followed his lead. A sudden, clumsy exodus of tailor suits. They were rats, and the ship was not only sinking, it was on fire. The last one to leave paused by the table. He was the one Mark had clapped on the shoulder, the one he lectured about synergy. He reached down and patted Mark's shoulder, a parody of their earlier camaraderie. Hey, he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. At least the wine was good. Then he turned his head and nodded respectfully toward George. Thanks, George. That final, deliberate act of gratitude toward his adversary was the ultimate betrayal. It officially transferred all power and respect to George, leaving Mark not just exposed, but utterly and completely alone. He was left sitting in the wreckage. The table, moments before a stage for his triumph, was now a scene of devastation. Half-empty glasses of obscenely expensive wine, plates of exquisite, barely touched food growing cold, and the dark leather folder that held a bill that George knew was well into the 5 figures. George watched him for a moment. He saw not a villain, but a pathetic, hollowed-out boy who had built a life out of paper and lies. and was now staring at the ashes. There was no victory in this, only a deep, profound sadness for his daughter. Slowly, George stood up. He gave a subtle nod to the waiter who had been hovering nearby, watching the entire drama unfold with professional impassivity. The waiter approached, his eyes carefully avoiding Mark's stunned face. George didn't even look at the bill. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet. From it, he produced a sleek, heavy black card, the American Express Centurion. He handed it to the waiter. Then, he looked down at his son-in-law. His voice was devoid of gloating, devoid of anger. It was just the cold, hard truth. "I will pay for this, Mark," he said quietly. "Not for you, but for the reputation of my family, which you almost tarnished tonight." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, his steps measured and even on the plush carpet. He passed the Abernathy's table, gave them a slight apologetic nod, and continued toward the exit without looking back. The camera, had there been one, would have stayed on Mark. It would have captured him sitting there, a solitary figure at a banquet table meant for 8. It would have focused on his stunned, ashen face, the single bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. Then, it would pan down to the bill sitting in front of him, a stark, numerical summary of his spectacular failure. He had gambled everything on a single performance, and he had lost it all. The restaurant was still full, the low hum of quiet conversation and clinking glasses continued all around him, but in that moment, Mark was the loneliest man in the world. He had everything, and now he had nothing. For what felt like a very long time, Mark didn't move. He remained a statue of ruin amidst the opulent debris of his failed coronation. The sounds of the restaurant, which had faded into a dull roar in the moments after George's departure, slowly came back into focus. The gentle murmur of conversation from other tables, the discreet clink of cutlery on porcelain, the soft footsteps of a waiter. Each normal, happy sound was a fresh insult, a reminder that the world had not stopped for his personal apocalypse. In fact, it hadn't even noticed. His mind, a frantic hamster on a wheel, spun through a Rolodex of excuses, justifications, and counterattacks, but they were all useless. George had been too precise, too clinical. He hadn't used insults. He had used facts. And facts were immovable objects against which Mark's blustering force had proven utterly powerless. Humiliation was a hot, physical thing, prickling at the back of his neck. He could feel the eyes of the other diners on him, even if they were politely pretending not to look. He was a spectacle, the loudmouth who had finally gotten his comeuppance. Then, a new thought, primal and cowardly, slithered into his mind. Just leave. George had paid, hadn't he? He could just stand up and walk out, disappear into the night. It was a childish impulse, a flight response from a cornered animal. He pushed his chair back, his movements furtive and jerky. He was halfway to his feet when a calm voice stopped him. "Sir?" It was the manager, the same man who had seated them with such deference earlier in the evening. His expression was a perfect, polite mask, but his eyes were firm. He was blocking Mark's path to the exit. "Mr. George has taken care of the bill," the manager said, his voice a low murmur that wouldn't carry. "But he asked me to give you this." He held out a small, white business card. Mark took it automatically, his fingers numb. He looked down. It wasn't a lawyer's card, or a banker's. It was for 5-star car service. The font was a cheap, garish gold, and the cardstock felt flimsy, like a playing card from a child's game. It wasn't the Blacktown car service he and Chloe used, the one with the Escalades and the discreet, silent drivers. This was a budget service, the kind you call for a ride to JFK at 4 in the morning. A final, exquisitely tailored insult. It was George's way of saying, "This is your level now. This is where you belong." The walk out of Per Se was the longest of his life. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, but he could feel the pity and contempt radiating from the tables he passed. The cold night air of Columbus Circle hit him like a slap, waking him from his daze. He wasn't in an Escalade. He was standing on a curb, alone, fumbling with his phone to summon a car whose cheapness was a direct reflection of his new reality. A Toyota Camry pulled up a few minutes later, the universal sign for an UberX. The interior smelled faintly of old coffee and artificial pine air freshener. As they pulled into the stream of traffic, the glittering lights of the city that had once seemed like a kingdom at his feet now felt alien and mocking. But then, a flicker of hope. Chloe? Of course. Chloe would understand. Chloe would soothe him. She would be furious at her father for his cruelty. She was his fortress, his ever-adoring audience, the one person whose belief in him was absolute. He had spent years cultivating that belief, watering it with grand promises and carefully edited versions of reality. George had just been a jealous old man trying to tear him down. He would explain it all to her. She would wrap her arms around him, and her love would be a shield against everything else. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over her picture. As he prepared his story, composing the opening lines of his victim's aria, a small, uncomfortable memory surfaced. He remembered the way she'd stopped asking about his work with that wide-eyed excitement she used to have. He remembered the hollow look in her eyes a few weeks ago when he'd been sketching out their future on a napkin. He'd seen it, but he had mistaken her exhaustion for contentment, her silence for admiration. The memory was a tiny crack in the foundation of his hope, but he pushed it away. He pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring. Mark? Chloe, baby, he began, letting his voice crack, injecting it with all the self-pity he could muster. You won't believe what your father just did. He humiliated me in front of everyone. It was a nightmare. He set me up. He waited for the explosion of sympathy, the angry denunciation of her father. It didn't come. Instead, there was a beat of silence, a pocket of dead air that felt strangely heavy. When she spoke again, her voice was different. It wasn't panicked or angry as he'd expected. It was eerily, terrifyingly calm. He called me, Mark, she said. The sentence was flat, devoid of emotion. It hung in the air between them, dismantling his entire narrative before he'd even had a chance to build it. About an hour ago, he told me everything. Mark's blood ran cold. The cheap upholstery of the Camry suddenly felt scratchy against his skin. The driver had a soft rock station playing, a song about lost love that was suddenly the soundtrack to his life falling apart. So, Chloe continued, her voice still holding that terrifying calm. Let me just ask you, the investor from Dubai, is he real? It was a simple question, but it felt like an accusation and a verdict all in one. It's complicated, Mark stammered, the words feeling like sand in his mouth. He fell back on his old defense, the one that had always worked before. It's business. You wouldn't understand. Another silence. This one was longer, more profound. Mark could hear his own ragged breathing, the soft click of the car's turn signal, the distant wail of a siren. He felt a desperate urge to fill the silence, to say anything. But he had nothing left to say. Her silence was a weapon, and it was disarming him completely. Finally, she spoke again, and her voice was no longer calm. It was brittle, like ice about to shatter. I understand that my father just paid a $7,000 bill for you and your partners, she said, the word partners dripping with a sarcasm he had never heard from her before. I understand that our rent is 3 months overdue, because I got another notice today. The one you told me was a clerical error. I understand the Porsche's being repossessed next week. She took a shaky breath. So what else don't I understand, Mark? He was cornered. His last ally had become his interrogator. George hadn't just defeated him. He had armed his daughter with the truth, turning Mark's last safe harbor into the front line of a new, more devastating war. His downfall was not just financial or social. It was absolute. He couldn't form a response. The self-satisfied predator was gone, replaced by a frightened man in the back of a cheap car, realizing that the one person he thought he owned had just declared her independence. The silence stretched again, but this time, she was the one to end it. We'll talk when you get home, Mark, she said, and the warmth was entirely gone from her voice, replaced by something cold and hard. There's a lot to talk about. Then she hung up. The click of the disconnected call was the loudest sound Mark had ever heard. He was alone, in the dark, in a stranger's car, heading towards a home that was no longer a home, to a wife who was no longer his wife. in any way that mattered. Her silence had been more terrifying than any scream, and her final promise of a conversation felt like a death sentence. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? The ride from Columbus Circle to their Tribeca loft was the longest, most silent journey of Mark's life. The soft rock on the Uber's radio had faded into a meaningless drone. Each red light was a fresh torment, prolonging his suspension in this cheap, pine-scented purgatory. All he could think about was Chloe's voice on the phone, that new, terrifying calmness that had sliced through his carefully constructed victim narrative and left him bleeding on the side of the road. He spent the journey frantically trying to reassemble his story, to find a new angle, a fresh light that would patch the gaping holes her questions had torn in his reality. He would tell her George was trying to break them up, that this was a test of their love. He would be contrite, wounded, a man battered by a cruel world, retreating to the one safe harbor he had left. He rehearsed the lines in his head, polishing the words, trying to recapture the old magic that had always worked on her. By the time the Camry pulled up outside his gleaming glass and steel apartment building, he had managed to construct a flimsy, desperate hope. He could still fix this. He had to. The night doorman, a man to whom Mark usually gave a curt, dismissive nod, looked at him differently tonight. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, pity, awkwardness. He simply said, "Good evening, Mr. Redding." But the Mr. Redding sounded hollow, a courtesy title that had already expired. The elevator ride up was a silent ascent to his execution. The soft ding as it arrived at the penthouse floor sounded like a death knell. He took a deep breath, pasted a look of weary anguish on his face, and opened the door. He was prepared for tears. He was prepared for screaming. He was not prepared for the silence. The apartment was pristine, silent, and cold. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floors. It looked less like a home and more like a showroom that had been closed for the night. And there, standing just inside the doorway, was a suitcase. One of his, a large, leather, Samsonite, zipped and ready, its telescopic handle extended, as if waiting for a hand to pull it away. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked past the suitcase, into the vast, open-plan living area. And there she was. Chloe was sitting on their white leather sofa, the one that had cost an obscene amount of money they didn't have. She wasn't crying. She wasn't wringing her hands. She was wearing a simple silk blouse and jeans, and she looked more poised and self-possessed than he had ever seen her. In her lap was a thin manila folder. As he stood there, frozen in the doorway, she calmly turned the page. Panic, raw and acidic, rose in his throat. This was not the scene he had rehearsed for. This was not his wife. This was a stranger. "Chloe, honey," he began, his voice coming out as a hoarse croak. He took a step forward, trying to project the old, gentle confidence. "Let me explain. It's a temporary cash flow problem." "Temporary?" She didn't look up from the folder. Her voice was as cool and smooth as the marble countertop in their kitchen. "The eviction notice came 3 weeks ago, Mark, the final one." She paused. "I found it in the back of your desk drawer, under your old college yearbooks." He stopped dead. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. She had been searching his things. The docile, trusting Chloe he had so carefully cultivated would never have done that. He tried another tack, the wounded husband. "Why were you going through my desk? Don't you trust me?" She turned another page in the folder. This time, he could see what was on it. The familiar logo of their credit card statement. "I started trusting my own instincts, actually," she said, still not looking at him. "My father's call tonight, it wasn't a revelation, Mark. It was a confirmation. It was a key that unlocked 100 other little things that didn't make sense." She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, clear and cold and utterly devoid of the adoration he was used to seeing, pinned him to the spot. Like this trip to the Hamptons with investors last month. His stomach clenched. He knew which trip she meant. "It's funny," Chloe continued, a strange, clinical curiosity in her tone. "The charges aren't from steakhouses or golf clubs. They're from a Tiffany & Co. in East Hampton, and a 2-night stay at the Surfrider, a hotel known for discretion." She looked down at the paper, then back up at him. Her name is Tiffany, isn't it? The irony is almost poetic. The name, spoken aloud in this cold, quiet room, was a physical blow. He actually staggered back a step, his hand coming up to brace himself against the wall. The world was dissolving into a dizzying, nauseating blur. The financial lies were one thing he could spin those, explain them away as the rough and tumble of the business world. But this was different. This was a betrayal of another, more fundamental kind. Chloe, he whispered, his voice failing him. That's not. Your father has been poisoning you against me. He's trying to destroy us. It was his last desperate gambit. The final blame-shifting deflection of a man with nothing left. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It wasn't anger or hurt. It was a kind of weary pity. She closed the folder with a soft, final thump. No, Mark, she said, and her voice was firm. The voice of a woman who had spent a long, dark night wrestling with her demons and had emerged victorious. My father gave me the truth. You gave me lies. For years. She stood up, a fluid, graceful movement that underscored her complete control of the situation. The difference is, I finally decided which one I prefer to live with. Get the loose, She didn't need to raise her voice. Her quiet certainty was more devastating than any scream could ever be. He saw it then, the complete and utter collapse of his entire world. The penthouse, the cars, the friends, the wife. It was all a house of cards, and the last card had just been pulled. He looked from her cold, determined face to the packed suitcase by the door. It wasn't just clothes. It was the end of his entire world, packed neatly into a leather Samsonite. Your things are packed, Chloe said, gesturing toward the suitcase. Her hand was perfectly steady. Please leave. I've already spoken to the doorman. He knows not to let you up again. The finality of it was absolute. There was no negotiation, no room for argument. He had been tried, judged, and sentenced in the space of a single evening. He opened his mouth to beg, to plead, to rage. He wasn't sure which, but no words came out. What was there to say? She had the evidence. She had the truth. And he had nothing. He walked toward the door like a man in a trance, his movements stiff and robotic. He grabbed the handle of the suitcase. The cool leather felt alien in his hand. At the door, he turned back one last time, a desperate, final appeal in his eyes. Chloe was still standing by the sofa, watching him. She wasn't crying. She was just watching him go. And in her eyes, he saw not the end of her love for him, but the beginning of her love for herself. He had not only lost a wife, he had lost his lifeline, and he had no one to blame but himself. The polished lobby of his former life receded behind the closing glass doors, and the city hit him with the force of a physical assault. Tribeca at night was a performance of effortless success. A world Mark had worked so hard to convince everyone, most of all himself, that he belonged to. Now he was on the outside, a ghost haunting the set. The laughter spilling from the open doors of Bayard and the audience sounded like a foreign language. Couples, glowing with the easy confidence that came from secure wealth, strolled past him. Their casual chatter, a symphony of everything he had just lost. He started walking, his hand clamped around the handle of the Samsonite, the little wheels clicking an irritating, jaunty rhythm on the uneven pavement. He had nowhere to go. The suitcase, once a symbol of exciting getaways and power meetings, was now an anchor, a rolling monument to his failure. He was a cliché, the man on the street with his life in the bag. His mind was a chaotic storm of self-pity and rage. It was George's fault. The old man, bitter and jealous, had orchestrated this whole thing. And Chloe, how could she turn on him so quickly? After everything he'd given her, the apartment, the clothes, the life, he conveniently edited out the fact that none of it had ever really been his to give. He was the victim here, a visionary, misunderstood and betrayed. He clung to this narrative like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, because the alternative that he was a fraud, a liar, and the failure was too terrifying to contemplate. He wandered aimlessly for what felt like hours, his feet growing sore in his expensive but worn-out shoes. He found himself on a quieter street, staring into the brightly lit window of an art gallery. Inside, a sculpture of twisted, gleaming metal stood on a white pedestal, a piece he had once loudly declared to Chloe he was considering acquiring. The memory was so sharp, so recent, it felt like a physical blow. He saw his reflection in the glass, a haggard-looking man in a wrinkled suit, holding a suitcase, a specter of want haunting a temple of plenty. It was then that his phone vibrated in his pocket. The sharp buzz was a jolt to his system. He fumbled for it, a wild, desperate hope flaring in his chest. Maybe it was Chloe. Maybe she'd had time to think, to realize she'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe she was calling to tell him to come home. But the name on the screen wasn't Chloe. It was Alex. Alex, the sleek-haired one, the one who had been his most ardent disciple, the first to laugh at his jokes, the one who'd called him a legend in the making. Just last week, the hope didn't die. It shifted. Of course, Alex was calling to check on him. He probably felt terrible about how things had gone down. He was the one friend who would see past George's lies and offer a hand, a couch to crash on, a bridge loan to get him back on his feet. This was it. A lifeline. He swiped to answer, composing his face into a mask of weary tragedy. Alex, man, he began, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. You're not going to believe the night I'm having, Mark. The voice on the other end was flat, cold, and utterly devoid of sympathy. It cut through his performance like a shard of ice. Don't talk, just listen. Mark froze, his mouth half open. The authority in Alex's tone was absolute, the kind Mark usually reserved for himself. After we left per se, the voice continued, a chillingly methodical cadence in the words. A few of us were, let's say, motivated to make some calls. My dad got a strange tip from an old friend of George's, a journalist at the Journal, who suggested he take a closer look at our little investment. Mark's blood turned to ice water in his veins. George. The old man hadn't just set a fire. He had directed the fire department to all the other flammable materials Mark had left lying around. So we called our contacts. Alex went on, his voice starting to lose its cold control and swell with a raw, vibrating anger. The so-called angel investor in Zurich, whose name you kept dropping. Funny thing, he's never heard of you. The bank you said was handling the wire transfer, they have no record of any such transaction. It was all a lie, wasn't it, Mark? All of it. Alex, listen, it's a misunderstanding, Mark stammered. But it was like trying to stop a freight train with a feather. You didn't just lie to us, you son of a bitch, Alex snarled. The civility completely gone now, replaced by the raw fury of a rich kid who's been made to look like a fool. You committed fraud. The 50 grand I gave you 2 months ago for emergency server costs, my father's forensic accountant, it took him all of 90 minutes. By the way, traced it. It wasn't wired to a data center in Virginia. It was transferred to your personal account. And the very next day, there was a charge for $48,000 at Cartier. Alex paused, letting the silence hang like a guillotine. You know, for a down payment on Chloe's new diamond bracelet. The specificity of the accusation stole the air from Mark's lungs. It was irrefutable, a direct line from his crime to his lie. He had been so arrogant, so sure of his own cleverness, that he hadn't even bothered to cover his tracks. So, this is not a friendly call, Alex concluded, his voice returning to a cold, flat monotone that was somehow more terrifying than his anger. This is a heads up. Our legal team will be filing a lawsuit for wire fraud and embezzlement tomorrow morning. You'll be served with the papers by noon. The process server already has your photo. He added one final chilling instruction. Don't leave town. The phone clicked dead. Mark stood motionless under the cold, white glare of a streetlight, the phone still pressed to his ear. The vibrant, noisy world of Tribeca seemed to fade, the sounds of traffic and laughter and life receding into a distant, muffled roar. He was no longer just a social pariah. He was no longer just broke and homeless. He was a criminal. The word echoed in the sudden, silent void of his mind. Fraud, embezzlement. These weren't abstract business terms anymore. They were cages, closing in around him. He had lost his home, his friends, his wife, and his money, all in the space of a few hours. He had thought that was the end, that he had hit rock bottom. He was wrong. Rock bottom was a luxury he couldn't afford. This wasn't just the end. It was the beginning of a whole new kind of hell. The days that followed were a study in the return of quiet. George found himself reclaiming small territories of peace. Mark's chaos had usurped, reading the entire newspaper in his armchair without interruption, enjoying a glass of wine on the terrace as the sun went down, the silence filled only by the distant, ambient hum of the city. He'd had one long, wrenching conversation with Chloe, who was shattered but, beneath the grief, possessed a new and unfamiliar steeliness. The storm had passed, leaving behind the somber, clarifying light that follows a destructive squall. He was returning from his club, the late autumn air on the Upper East Side crisp and invigorating. As he approached the familiar brass and glass entrance of his building, he saw a smudge of disorder on the pristine sidewalk. A man, hunched and ill at ease, stood by the corner. George's pace didn't falter, but a sense of weary finality settled over him. Even from a distance, he recognized the ruin of his son-in-law. The swaggering creature from Per Se was gone, replaced by a gray ghost. Mark was thinner, unshaven, and wore a rumpled coat that looked wholly inadequate against the biting wind. As George drew near, Mark pushed himself off the wall and stumbled forward, intercepting him on the marble sidewalk just shy of the building's grand awning. The doorman, Frank, tensed by the entrance, but George gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "George, please." The voice was a reedy, desperate croak. Mark's eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a panic that had burned past arrogance and landed squarely on terror. "You have to help me. They're going to destroy me. Alex and his father, they're pressing charges. Fraud. Embezzlement." He gestured wildly with a trembling hand. "I'll go to prison, George. I'll lose everything. Are you..." He spoke the last words as if it were a future possibility, not a present reality. He was a man drowning, begging the one who'd pointed out the hole in his boat to patch it. George simply looked at him, feeling not triumph, but a profound, aching sadness for the sheer waste of it all. Mark, mistaking silence for consideration, pressed on, the words tumbling out in a frantic, undignified rush. "Just one phone call, George. That's all it would take. You're respected. If you tell them it was a misunderstanding, they'll listen. I'll pay them back. I swear. I'll do anything." The word hung in the cold air between them. Anything. George finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of the last week. "Anything, Mark? A few days ago, all I asked for was a little respect. For me, for my daughter. You couldn't manage that." The memory of his own cross words, personal ATM, visibly landed on Mark's face, and the flicker of hope in his eyes died. George took a small step back, creating a definitive space between them. "You built this," he continued, his tone calm, like a professor explaining an immutable law of physics. "Every lie, every shortcut, every betrayal. Each one was a break. You thought you were building a palace, but you were building a prison. This is a structure you designed for yourself. I can't save you from it." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And frankly, I won't." On the days, he saw the final, utter collapse in Mark's posture. The man seemed to shrink, the last bit of fight draining out of him, leaving only an empty husk. George prepared to turn away, to leave this chapter behind on the cold sidewalk. But there was one last thing that needed to be said, not for revenge, but for the final, painful truth. "You didn't lose everything, Mark," George said, his voice dropping to an almost gentle whisper. "You can't lose what you never truly had." He looked at the disheveled man, at the ghost of his son-in-law, and delivered the verdict. "You just finally have to live with what you truly are. Nothing." George turned then, without another glance. Frank the doorman pulled the heavy glass door open, and as George stepped from the cold chaos of the street into the warm, ordered silence of the lobby, he did not look back. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you? And where are you listening? 4 months later, spring had arrived, and with it, a new kind of quiet in the penthouse. It was a shared, productive silence, punctuated by the easy back and forth of conversation. The terrace, once a stage for a narcissist performance, had been reclaimed. It was now a burgeoning garden, a joint project between father and daughter. They sat at a small wrought iron table, surrounded by pots of rich, dark soil. Chloe, her hair tied back, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, was carefully tending to a new set of gardenias. She seemed more grounded, more present than George had seen her in years. The city sprawled below them, its constant hum a distant, comforting soundtrack. It was Chloe who broke the peaceful silence, her eyes remaining on the plant in her hands. I heard from my lawyer today. They set Mark's trial date for next month. She finally looked up, her gaze clear and direct. What do you think will happen? George considered it, feeling a distinct lack of vengeful satisfaction. The entire sordid affair now felt less like a personal battle and more like a necessary, if painful, market correction. The evidence is overwhelming, he said, his voice objective. Alex and the other investors have a mountain of paperwork. He committed fraud. Chloe, he'll go to prison. I think some watching. She nodded slowly, absorbing the finality of it. A shadow of a long ago sadness passed over her face. A brief mourning not for the man Mark was, but for the man she had desperately wanted him to be. I think, she said, her voice soft but firm, I was in love with the idea of him, the performance, the life he promised. She let out a short, mirthless laugh. He was such a good salesman, and I was his most loyal customer. I just kept buying, even when I knew, deep down, that the product was defective. It was a stark, honest confession. It was the sound of her finally setting herself free. George felt a surge of pride so immense it almost hurt. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Her skin was cool, smelling of earth. We all make bad investments, Chloe, he said gently. In business, in life, the important thing isn't that you don't make mistakes. It's knowing when to cut your losses and reinvest in something worthwhile. He squeezed her hand. Like yourself. A genuine smile, the first truly radiant one he'd seen from her in a long time, lit up her face. A good CFO knows when to write off a bad asset, right? Exactly, he said, smiling back. I enrolled, by the way, she said, her energy shifting from reflective to hopeful, at Columbia for the fall, a master's in art history, the one I always talked about. It's... George's heart swelled. He thought of the Helen Frankenthaler painting, the one whose story Mark had tried to steal. It had been Chloe who had the real eye, who saw not just the value, but the beauty. I want to work in a gallery, maybe a museum, she continued, her words painting a picture of a future built on substance, not smoke. I want to be around things that are real, things with history, things that last. Is not payment those? The sun began its slow descent, setting the sky ablaze in shades of orange and violet. The lights of the city began to flicker on, creating highways of light that stretched to the horizon. The view from the penthouse, once a backdrop for lies, was now simply a beautiful, shared vista. George looked at his daughter, at the quiet confidence in her eyes, and felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into his touch. Your mother, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She would be very proud of you. Chloe's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon, at the endless possibilities of a future that was, for the first time in a long time, entirely her own.